Hi, my name is Valery Leikin and I'm product manager from Dynatrace. I want to walk you through today through the integration with SonarQube for vulnerability ingestion into Dynatrace. But before that, just a few words about the platform of Dynatrace. Dynatrace is a data intelligence platform that monitors your environment, and within your environment it discovers different issues and problems and can identify things such as performance issues as well as the runtime vulnerabilities. We integrate with partners such as SonarQube for data ingestion to enrich and reach out our visibility into pre-production environments and to your code and build time. For example, what Dynatrace monitoring capabilities look like can be visualized in Smartscape application, where you can see all the different entities, in this example Kubernetes cluster, being monitored with various containers monitored by Dynatrace. And this is a visual representation that allows you also to dive deeper into each and every runtime entity. So for example, I can click and dive into a specific container. Okay, so this is a few words about Dynatrace. Now let's talk about the SonarQube integration and how it's all connected together: code time, build time, and runtime. The SonarQube integration is delivered as an extension which you can install, and then the Dynatrace extension fetches SonarQube vulnerabilities as well as quality ratings and ingest them into Dynatrace. And within Dynatrace, we visualize both those vulnerability findings as well as the quality metrics, which I will demonstrate next. As soon as the data is ingested into Dynatrace, it's being mapped to so-called semantic dictionary, which allows it to prioritize and work uniformly with any kind of data ingested into Dynatrace. In this example, SonarQube findings are being ingested and summarized in a dashboard where you can explore and prioritize vulnerabilities by risk, explore individual findings, and connect actually to the original finding from SonarQube if you want to look at it, for example, or understand the various levels of distribution of the vulnerabilities and the issues discovered, which repositories they are, what are the top affected objects or code artifacts in other words, and what are the top affected vulnerable components. At the same time, what is possible to do is to look at SonarQube posture overview based on various rating ingested into Dynatrace. So this is essentially summarizes for your projects all the data that you're probably familiar from SonarQube already, with the security ratings, reliability, maintainability, etc. Here you can also use this data not only for visualization, but rather in Dynatrace you can also automate on top of any ingested data. As a quick example, a simple one, the ingested vulnerability findings can be automated with Dynatrace workflows, where you can query the ingested data which resides within Dynatrace database, which called Grail, and fetch the data, fetch the new vulnerabilities, filter them based on the criticality, and then notify different stakeholders. You can create tickets, notify in Slack, Teams, etc. Where it really becomes interesting is with the runtime contextualization. I have showed the Smartscape and the Dynatrace ability to monitor runtime entities, and this is the point which becomes the most valuable for our customers when they integrate code vulnerability findings and they want to verify and understand whether they affect any of the production applications. And it's possible actually to filter and narrow down and prioritize those vulnerabilities with this runtime context. Here is an example of a workflow that I just set up to demonstrate those capabilities, in this example, I'm querying or the workflow triggers every time there is a new critical or high vulnerability ingested from SonarQube. And I want to contextualize them only with the production entities. So I don't care about any of my staging on development environments. I really want to understand if a new vulnerability or an existing vulnerability affects some of the production entities. In this example that I'm walking you through, I'm demonstrating how we contextualize it to containers running in Kubernetes. So it's a few queries on top of the Smartscape and the original event coming from SonarQube, which I will later show how it looks like. We can actually add this context, understand which artifacts are being affected in runtime. And the way that we're doing here is by a lookup of the repository names and the service names deployed in the environment. Maybe as a quick example, coming back to this container and the workload. So when it is deployed, Dynatrace actually sees all the configuration of your deployment. And as part of this configuration, we also read all the specification and environment variables. And if you put in the labels or environment variables of your deployments, labels such as production, staging, etc., this is exactly where we can understand and bring the value of prioritization with runtime context. So jumping back to the workflow, what happens next? We also want to add additional runtime context, such as exposure to the internet or a proximity to sensitive data assets. The way that we do that is that in Dynatrace we have an additional capability which is called Runtime Vulnerability Analytics, which analyzes your runtime entities for vulnerabilities in runtime, at runtime. So it means that we are looking at all the connections that Dynatrace has and analyze whether there are external connectivity or database services accessible from those points. And this information is very useful when prioritizing the vulnerabilities. So what this workflow does, it also adds the context about the exposure status, whether it's public internet or not, and the data asset status and accessibility. Then what happens next is that we ingest the enriched events back into Dynatrace so that we can later also work with those enriched events, and I will show in a second how. And we also want to create a ticket. So you can imagine this workflow triggers on critical and high vulnerabilities, but it does not create a ticket for each and every vulnerability. It only would create a ticket for vulnerabilities that affect your production applications. So in that sense, we first query if there are already existing vulnerabilities, and we're using Dynatrace Intelligence workflow action that is capable of summarizing all the insights that were collected by different actions in this workflow and prepare a Jira ticket for you. So a very simple and straightforward AI usage in this case. And finally, we create the ticket in Jira. So now I will show an example of the ticket created by such a workflow. Here is a Jira ticket that summarizes and says that this is a confirmed vulnerability from SonarQube confirmed by Dynatrace. It provides a few quick insights about the vulnerability, as well as what exact entities being mapped and matched for this vulnerability. From here on, you can also drill in and open this specific Dynatrace entity. In this example, it's a Kubernetes workload. And you can understand why Dynatrace and this workflow choose this vulnerability, because there is a tag with production, which was set as part of the workflow as something to look for in the deployments. Then it also tells here whether there is any public internet exposure or sensitive data access allowed or possible from this entity. And in this case, you can see that there is a public internet exposure. And in addition to that, from the Dynatrace Runtime Vulnerability Analytics, it also brings some additional summary of what other vulnerabilities exist in this workload. And in this case, there are 2 additional vulnerabilities that you can also drill in and explore within Dynatrace. Those vulnerabilities are not directly related to SonarQube vulnerabilities, but it just provides additional information about what else is wrong and is possible and vulnerable on top of the same entities monitored by Dynatrace. I mentioned that we ingest those events back to Dynatrace, which also allows to visualize it in the same dashboard that I showed in the beginning. So this dashboard shows initially the SonarQube findings, but there is a section where we also provide you the contextualization to runtime entities. And in this example, you can see that we have mapped a container right there with critical issues discovered and mapped from SonarQube. And from here, it's also possible to drill into this container and view additional details. So this is the container, which is part of the same cluster that we have seen before. And if we want to drill into the namespace and analyze what other things exist in this environment or who owns them, this information also exists in Dynatrace, which also allows you to better address issues in the runtime. All right. Moving on, another use case which is possible to be accomplished with this runtime contextualization is security gates. In SonarQube, you're probably familiar with security gates for the code findings, but in runtime, there is also such a thing as a security gate. For example, if you want to deploy your application from staging environment to production while running Dynatrace and staging environment, you can also benefit from this additional security gate, which would take the SonarQube findings contextualized by Dynatrace runtime entities and check whether there are any enriched findings from critical and high risk levels that affect your production application. So basically affect your runtime entities. And in that case, the security gate will fail, and you can also use workflows as a mechanism to connect to this execution of the security gate and then notify stakeholders as soon as it's failed. You can also integrate this workflow as part of your deployment process and roll back the deployment if such thing exists. So you have a lot of possibilities to play around and automate around those findings. Yes, so coming back to this dashboard and summing up, this is how Dynatrace and SonarQube together help to both see your runtime and shift left to your code time, connecting those 2 worlds together to understand what impact your code level vulnerabilities have on your runtime and production applications. Thank you.